It started with a name, just a name. At the international airport that morning, passengers shuffled through security like they always did, tired parents trying to keep kids calm, business travelers glued to their phones, and students nervously clutching passports as though the thin booklet was their lifeline. Among them was a young black woman named Amara Okiki. She was 24, a recent graduate who had just earned a scholarship to continue her studies abroad. She was excited, nervous, and maybe a little overwhelmed. But she was also hopeful, because for the first time in her life, she felt like the world was about to open up for her. Her dream was simple. She wanted to become an environmental scientist. She wanted to study how climate change was destroying rural communities like the one she grew up in, where clean water was a privilege and electricity was a miracle. Her mother had sold food by the roadside, her father had worked as a bus driver, and neither had ever stepped foot on an airplane. She would be the first. But as Amara approached the immigration desk, her heart beating fast with excitement, everything began to crumble in ways she could never have imagined. The officer at the counter glanced at her passport, frowned, and typed something into his computer. His expression changed almost instantly. He didn't say anything at first, just reached for the phone and muttered something too low for her to hear. Another officer appeared, then another. Amara looked around. The people in line behind her shifted impatiently, some craning their necks to see what was happening. She smiled nervously, trying to stay calm, but inside her chest, panic was growing. "Step aside," the officer said flatly. Amara obeyed. She stood to the side, clutching her backpack tightly, while two uniformed officers whispered and stared at her as though she had just set off an alarm. She tried to ask what was wrong, but they only told her to wait. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, without warning, two more officers appeared, this time in plain clothes with badges clipped to their belts. "Miss Okiki?" one of them asked. "Yes," she said softly. "You're coming with us." Her heart dropped. "Why? What's going on?" They didn't answer. They flanked her on either side and began walking. She stumbled a little, her suitcase bumping along behind her as curious onlookers stared. Someone pulled out a phone. Within seconds, Amara was surrounded by flashing lenses as strangers recorded her being escorted away. She kept asking, "What's happening? Please, what's happening?" But the only response was silence. They took her to a small interrogation room, sterile and cold. A metal table sat in the center, two chairs on either side. She sat down, her palms sweating, her legs trembling beneath the table. The officers closed the door, and one of them slid her passport across the table. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. Amara shook her head. "Your name?" He tapped the passport with his finger. "It matches a name on our watch list. A very serious individual. We need to verify your identity." Amara blinked, confused. "But my name is common. And look at me. I'm a student. I have my scholarship papers. I have everything." "Doesn't matter," the officer interrupted. "Your name came up." At first, she thought it was a cruel mistake that would quickly be cleared up. They would check the details, realize she wasn't whoever they thought she was, and let her go. But as hours passed, her optimism began to fade. They asked her the same questions repeatedly. Where were you born? Who were her parents? What schools did she attend? Did she know anyone overseas? Did she have ties to groups they wouldn't approve of? Each time she gave the same answers. Each time they seemed dissatisfied. When she tried to insist they call her university, her professors, her family, they told her to be quiet. One officer even laughed and said, "You people always claim you're innocent." "You people?" That was the moment Amara realized this wasn't just about her name. It was about how she looked, where she came from, and the assumptions they had already made. By nightfall, they had confiscated her belongings and taken her to a detention center. She was strip-searched, fingerprinted, and photographed like a criminal. Her phone was seized. She had no way to contact her mother, who at that very moment was probably waiting for a call to say she'd landed safely. Instead, Amara sat alone in a cell, shivering in the thin jumpsuit they gave her, the cold concrete pressing against her back as she leaned against the wall. The sounds around her were terrifying, metal doors slamming, voices shouting, the clank of keys echoing down the corridor. She had never been inside a jail before. She had never even imagined she could end up in one. And yet, here she was, because her name sounded suspicious. The next morning, the story broke in the news. But it wasn't her story. Authorities arrest suspected terror recruit at international airport. That was the headline plastered across television screens. And beneath it, her photo, Amara, in handcuffs, looking terrified as she was escorted by officers. They didn't blur her face. They didn't wait for facts. They branded her a suspect before she had even seen a lawyer. Her friends back home were shocked. Professors called each other, confused. How could Amara, the quiet, brilliant girl who had spent her entire undergraduate years in the library, be linked to terrorism? It didn't make sense, but the news didn't care about sense. It cared about spectacle. By day 2, social media was on fire. Hashtags spread rapidly. Some people demanded justice for her. Others called her guilty without knowing a thing about her. Accounts shared rumors that she had suspicious ties to organizations abroad. None of it was true, but once the narrative began, it was impossible to control. Inside her cell, Amara wasn't even aware of the firestorm outside. She was focused on survival. She hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. She couldn't sleep. Her heart raced constantly. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind, the officer frowning at her passport, the sudden coldness in his eyes, the words, "Step aside." The worst part was that she had no idea when it would end. On the 3rd day, she was brought before a judge. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, she shuffled into the courtroom. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashing as though she were some kind of celebrity criminal. Her mother sat in the back, weeping, her hands pressed tightly against her chest. The prosecutor spoke confidently. He claimed Amara's name matched that of an individual flagged in international intelligence reports. He called her a potential threat. Her lawyer, a tired-looking public defender assigned at the last minute, argued that there was no evidence, that she was a student with no criminal record, but the judge didn't seem convinced. "There is reasonable cause," the judge said. "She will remain in custody pending further investigation." The gavel came down, and just like that, Amara's fate was sealed. Her mother cried out, begging them to see reason. "That is my daughter. She is innocent. Look at her." But nobody looked. Nobody listened. As officers dragged her away, Amara locked eyes with her mother, silently pleading, "Don't give up on me." The next day, headlines screamed again, "Court denies bail for airport suspect." And in small print, buried in the article, was the detail nobody cared to notice. The name on the watch list wasn't even spelled the same way as hers. The so-called suspect was male, 5 years older, and had lived in a different country his entire life. But somehow, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that her name sounded suspicious. Outside the courthouse, a young man who had filmed her arrest uploaded the video to TikTok. In it, you could hear Amara's voice, shaky but desperate, as she cried out, "Check the spelling! Please, check the spelling!" The clip spread fast, racking up millions of views. People began to question the story. Comment sections exploded with outrage. Activists tweeted, "This is racial profiling at its worst." But Amara didn't know any of that yet. She was back in her cell, staring at the ceiling, wondering how a name, just a name, could ruin her life. Her cellmate, a woman with hollow eyes and tattoos running up her arms, leaned over one night and said, "You better pray. Once they put a label on you, it sticks. Doesn't matter if it's true." Amara turned her face to the wall and cried silently because she knew she was right. Her nightmare had only just begun, and outside, the world was about to discover just how deep the injustice went. Jail has a way of stripping a person down. It takes your name, your dignity, your identity, and replaces it with a number, a uniform, and silence. For Amara, the hardest part wasn't the cold concrete bed, or the tasteless food, or even the stares from guards who looked at her as though she was less than human. It was the not knowing. Not knowing how long she would be here. Not knowing what was being said about her on the outside. Not knowing if anyone would ever believe her. Every day started the same. A metallic clank of doors opening, guards shouting for inmates to line up, plastic trays of breakfast slid down a counter. She kept her head down, ate as much as she could stomach, and went back to her cell. Days blurred together, time lost meaning. The other women gave her looks. Some whispered about her, others asked outright, "So you're the terrorist girl?" One inmate sneered, her tone mocking. Amara shook her head, said softly, "I'm not," but the woman laughed and walked away. In here, labels mattered more than truth. Her lawyer came once, sitting across from her in the visitor's room, a pane of glass between them. He looked exhausted, as if she were just one file in a mountain of cases. "They're saying your name matches someone on the international watch list," he explained. "We're working on proving otherwise, but it may take time." Amara pressed her palms against the glass. "But it's not even spelled the same. It's not me. They must know that already." The lawyer exhaled heavily. "They don't care. Once they put you on paper, it's not about facts. It's about covering themselves. Nobody wants to admit they made a mistake, especially not in a case like this. Too much politics involved." That word, politics, made her stomach turn. She was just a student. She had no power, no influence, and yet somehow she had been thrown into a storm much bigger than herself. News clippings started filtering inside, guards carried newspapers, and occasionally other inmates would share headlines. They always made her heart sink. Suspected recruit denied bail again. Court extends custody pending investigation. Each headline painted her as dangerous. None of them mentioned the inconsistencies, the different spelling, the fact that the suspect they were really looking for was male, older, living in another country altogether. One day, during a hearing, the prosecutor presented evidence. It was a grainy document, half redacted, showing a list of names linked to suspicious activities abroad. One of the names, faintly typed, looked like hers. But when her lawyer pointed out that the listed name had a different middle initial, the judge dismissed it as a clerical error. The room went quiet. Amara's chest burned with rage. A clerical error? That so-called error was the reason she was behind bars. Meanwhile, outside the walls, her story was spreading faster than she realized. The TikTok clip of her shouting, "Check the spelling," had reached millions of views. A hashtag had begun trending. #, check the name. Students at her university organized a small rally on campus, holding up posters with her face, chanting for her release. Journalists began digging deeper, finding her professors, her classmates, anyone who could speak to her character. "Amara is brilliant," one professor told a reporter. She was one of my best students. There is no way she is who they claim she is." But the louder her supporters grew, the more stubborn the authorities became. Officials doubled down, repeating the same line to every media outlet. "We are conducting a thorough investigation. We cannot release sensitive details at this time." Inside her cell, Amara had no idea how big her story had become. All she knew was that the interrogations continued. Day after day, officers asked the same questions, sometimes with hostility, sometimes with feigned kindness. "Who do you talk to online? Where do you send money? Who do you really work for?" She answered each question truthfully, but they never seemed satisfied. One afternoon, she broke down mid-interrogation. "Why are you doing this to me? I'm innocent, don't you see? It's just my name." One officer leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Then, almost casually, he said, "Names carry weight. People like you should understand that. People like you." The words echoed in her head long after she was dragged back to her cell. The days grew darker. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She began to wonder if maybe this was how her life would end. Not with graduation, not with a career, not with hope, but with a name that condemned her. Her mother visited once, tears streaking her cheeks. Through the glass, she pressed her hands desperately against her daughter's. "Hold on, my child. People are fighting for you. They will see the truth." Amara wanted to believe her, but doubt was eating her alive. Then something happened that changed everything. A young journalist named Lila Torres got hold of leaked court documents. In them, she found something shocking. An internal note from investigators admitting that the suspect on their watch list had a different gender, different nationality, even a different date of birth. The note concluded with one chilling line: "Despite discrepancies, proceed with caution. Detaining the subject is safer than admitting error." That line exploded across social media. Screenshots of the document circulated with hashtags like #FreeAmara and #NameIsNotAGuilt. Activists began organizing protests outside the jail where she was held. Signs reading "Innocent until proven guilty" and "Check the spelling" filled the streets. Amara heard whispers of it inside. Other inmates told her, "Your people are outside. They're making noise for you." For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. But with hope came danger. The more public her case became, the more resistance she faced from those in power. Suddenly, her legal visits were restricted. Guards began treating her with more hostility. One guard muttered under his breath, "Your little fans won't save you." Meanwhile, the media war intensified. Some outlets framed her as a victim of racial profiling. Others doubled down on painting her as suspicious, suggesting her silence in interrogations meant guilt. Nobody seemed to notice or care that she had been shouting her innocence from day one. Her lawyer pushed for bail again, this time presenting character witnesses, professors, mentors, even her scholarship board. Each testified to her brilliance, her innocence, her integrity, but the judge once again refused, citing national security concerns. The gavel came down and Amara collapsed into tears. That night in her cell, she whispered to herself, "I will not break. I will not give them the satisfaction." But deep down, she feared she already was. Outside, the protests grew larger. TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, all flooded with videos and stories about her. Students marched with banners, celebrities tweeted their support. A group of lawyers volunteered to join her defense team. It seemed like the tide was turning. Then came the twist. Late one evening, her lawyer managed to slip her a message. Someone had leaked an audio recording. In it, an officer could be heard admitting, I don't care if it's not her. Her name matches and she looks the type. That's enough for me." The recording went viral instantly. Outrage hit new heights. Hashtags multiplied. Calls for her release echoed not just in her city, but globally. International organizations began asking questions. Human rights groups demanded transparency, but instead of releasing her, authorities doubled down again. The prosecutor announced they were reviewing new evidence that could link her to foreign communications. It was vague, deliberately so, but it was enough to stall her release. Inside her cell, Amara sat in stunned silence. The truth was out there now. The world had heard the officer admit it was profiling, nothing more. And yet she was still trapped. Her mother visited again, pressing her hand to the glass. "You see? People believe you now. They know the truth." But Amara's voice cracked as she whispered back, "Then why am I still here?" Silence. Her mother had no answer. And as the days dragged on, as protests raged louder, as her name became a symbol of injustice across the world, Amara realized something chilling. This wasn't about a name anymore. It was about power. About a system that would rather bury an innocent person alive than admit a mistake. And if the system had its way, she might never walk free again. The internet has a way of doing what courts, governments, and entire systems refuse to do. It amplifies. It takes a single moment, a single clip, a single cry, and turns it into something no one can ignore. For Amara, that moment was the shaky TikTok video of her being dragged through the airport screaming, "Check the spelling! Please, check the spelling!" It was raw, it was desperate, and it was undeniable. The video spread like wildfire, reshared across platforms, dissected by commentators, and remixed into protest chants. Within a week, millions of people who had never heard her name before were saying it, typing it, and demanding to know why she was behind bars. Outside the walls of her cell, the digital world was boiling. The hashtag number sign "check the name" topped trends for days. Students organized online petitions that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures overnight. Journalists from across the world requested interviews with her family, her professors, anyone who knew her. One investigative report showed side-by-side profiles. Amara, a 24-year-old student with no criminal record, and the man on the watch list, a 29-year-old male from another country. The discrepancies were obvious, glaring, undeniable. Yet still, the courts ignored it. Her cellmate noticed the change first. She leaned over one afternoon while they sat on their bunks and said, "They're talking about you out there? Big time. You've got people chanting your name." Amara looked up, unsure whether to believe it. She had no access to the outside world, no phone, no internet, no way to see for herself. All she had were whispers. Still, a flicker of hope stirred inside her. The protests began small, just a handful of students outside the courthouse with homemade signs reading, "Justice for Amara." But then the clip of an officer openly admitting, "She looked the type," spread. That sentence, dripping with casual prejudice, became a rallying cry. Soon the small crowd multiplied into hundreds, then thousands. Streets filled with people holding banners that read, "A name is not a crime," and "Stop racial profiling." They chanted in unison, their voices echoing through city blocks demanding her release. Media outlets picked up the story, but the coverage was split. Independent journalists highlighted the injustice, calling her case the clearest example yet of systemic bias. Mainstream networks, however, repeated the government's line. Authorities are still investigating ties to international threats. Panelists debated her guilt or innocence on primetime TV, as if her life were nothing more than a spectacle. Commentators who had never met her, who didn't know her background, spoke with authority about whether she fit the profile. Every time Amara's mother turned on the television, she wept at the way her daughter was being portrayed. Meanwhile, online investigators, digital sleuths armed with nothing but curiosity and stubbornness, began piecing together the truth. They tracked down the real man whose name vaguely resembled hers. They posted records showing he had been under surveillance years ago in another country entirely. They proved in thread after thread that Amara's detention was baseless. One viral post read, "She's in jail for being black and for having a name someone mispronounced." It gained millions of likes, cementing her story in the global consciousness. But with visibility came backlash. Hate groups latched onto her case, twisting it to fit their narratives. Some accounts claimed she was guilty, that the protests were performative, that she was hiding something. They circulated doctored images of her holding weapons, completely fabricated. The lies spread almost as fast as the truth. For Amara, trapped in her cell, the storm was invisible, but her fate was being fought over by millions of strangers she had never met. One night, her lawyer managed to slip her some news. He leaned close during a visitation and whispered, "The internet is on your side. People all over the world are talking about you." Amara stared at him, stunned. She had imagined maybe a handful of people cared, but the idea of global attention was overwhelming. "Then why am I still here?" she asked, her voice breaking. He shook his head. "Because admitting they were wrong would cost them more than keeping you locked up." The cover-up grew thicker. Reports emerged that key documents in her case had mysteriously vanished from court records. Files were mislabeled, evidence logs were altered, and internal memos disappeared overnight. Journalists who had obtained leaked information suddenly went silent, their articles scrubbed from websites. Rumors swirled that pressure was being applied from the highest levels to contain the scandal. The louder the protests outside grew, the tighter the grip inside became. Then a whistleblower appeared. An anonymous email landed in the inbox of journalist Lila Torres, the same reporter who had uncovered the redacted memo earlier. Attached were internal communications between officials. The emails revealed chilling details. Investigators had known within 48 hours that Amara was not the suspect they were looking for. They had confirmed the discrepancies early, yet decided to hold her anyway. One email read, "Public release admitting error is not advisable at this time. Recommend continued detainment under security justification until situation stabilizes." Another was even more damning. "Optics of release may undermine public confidence in security operations. Best to proceed cautiously, regardless of individual guilt." Torres prepared to publish immediately. The story was explosive. But hours before it went live, her newsroom servers were hacked, wiping the files. Backups vanished, and the whistleblower who had sent the emails disappeared. Their email account went dark, their online footprint erased. No one could trace them again. The story never saw the light of day, at least not in the way it was supposed to. Yet whispers of it leaked out, screenshots, fragments, second-hand retellings spread across forums. Though incomplete, they fueled more outrage. Protesters outside the jail chanted louder. Crowds swelled into tens of thousands. Drone footage of the demonstrations filled social media feeds worldwide. People carried candles at night, singing songs of solidarity. The world was watching. Inside, Amara heard the chants faintly on some nights. Through the cracks of her cell window, she caught echoes of voices shouting her name. She pressed her ear against the cold wall, tears streaming down her face, realizing that the world beyond those bars had not forgotten her. But the system fought back harder. Her visitation rights were suddenly restricted further. Guards searched her cell aggressively, tossing her few belongings onto the floor. She was denied phone calls for weeks. Once, during an interrogation, an officer leaned close and said, "No amount of hashtags is going to open that door for you." Still, the pressure mounted. Politicians began to weigh in. Some called for an independent inquiry, sensing the political cost of ignoring the protests. Others defended the authorities, insisting that national security cannot be compromised for public opinion. The divide was sharp. Every news cycle, Amara's name was back in headlines, her face flashing across screens. Her mother became a symbol too. Videos of her sobbing outside the courthouse, clutching a photo of her daughter, circulated widely. She gave interviews, her voice trembling but firm. "My child is innocent. You have stolen her future. Give her back to me." People connected with her pain, and donations poured in to support the family's legal battle. Then another leak hit the internet. This time, it was a short clip. Audio recorded secretly inside the detention center. In it, a guard could be heard mocking Amara, saying, "She thinks she's going to walk free because some kids are chanting outside. She doesn't get it. She's already been chosen to be the example." The word example sent chills across the internet. Example of what? Example to whom? Speculation erupted. Analysts debated whether Amara was being deliberately sacrificed to prove that the system was tough on threats, even when those threats didn't exist. The idea was horrifying, but believable. Meanwhile, Amara's health began to deteriorate. She lost weight rapidly, her cheeks hollow, her eyes dark and sunken. She fainted twice in her cell from exhaustion. When she asked for medical attention, it was delayed, dismissed as exaggeration. Other inmates began to worry about her, whispering that she might not survive if things continued this way. And yet, the outside world didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder. Artists painted murals of her face on city walls. Musicians wrote songs in her honor. Hashtags became slogans on t-shirts and posters. She was no longer just Amara. She had become a symbol, a rallying point for everyone who had ever felt the weight of injustice pressing against their lives. But symbols are dangerous. The system knew it, and so, in a shocking twist, prosecutors announced they were preparing to file new charges against her. The details were vague. Communications with suspicious entities, they claimed. But it was clear to anyone watching that this was a desperate attempt to keep her locked away. When her lawyer broke the news to her, Amara stared at him in disbelief. New charges? For what? He shook his head helplessly. For existing with the wrong name, it seems. The protests outside exploded in anger. How could new charges appear after evidence had already collapsed? How could the government double down in the face of so much public scrutiny? People demanded answers, but none came. And then, one night, the whistleblower reappeared. A cryptic post surfaced on an anonymous forum, claiming to be from the same source who had leaked the earlier emails. The message was short, almost chilling in its simplicity. They know it isn't her. They've always known. She was never meant to be released. Screenshots of the post spread instantly, reigniting the fury online. If true, it confirmed the darkest suspicions that Amara was not being held because of a mistake, but because she had become convenient, a body to fill a narrative, a name to justify a policy. Inside her cell, Amara sat awake, trembling. She didn't know about the post, not yet. All she knew was that the walls were closing in, that her world was shrinking, and that every day her chances of walking free felt smaller. But outside, the world was no longer quiet. It was loud, relentless, and unafraid, and it was only a matter of time before the system would have to decide, admit the truth or destroy her completely. By the time the third month of Amara's detention came, the protests outside had become almost ritual. Every morning, people gathered in front of the courthouse with banners and megaphones, their chants echoing through the city streets. Every evening, candles lit up sidewalks as supporters held vigils, their voices singing in the night. Amara had become more than a young woman jailed for a mistake. She was a symbol of the rot people felt deep in their bones, the proof that the system could crush anyone and call it justice. But inside the walls where she slept on a hard bunk and counted cracks in the ceiling to pass the time, the reality was darker, heavier, and more suffocating. Her health had declined badly. Her hair began to thin from stress, her skin dulled, and her weight dropped alarmingly. Guards noticed, but dismissed it. "She'll live," one muttered when she fainted in the cafeteria. When she begged for medical help, the nurse scribbled notes but offered little more than painkillers. Her lawyer filed complaints, but each one came back stamped with the same phrase: "Not a priority." The neglect wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. The cover-up grew thicker every day. Court filings disappeared mysteriously from the public record. One journalist tried to access her case documents, only to find them classified overnight. Freedom of information requests were stonewalled. When one sympathetic clerk leaked a piece of information about her hearings, she was fired within days. It was as if invisible hands were working tirelessly to keep Amara buried under a mountain of secrecy. Her lawyer, who had once seemed weary and beaten down, started showing up with 2 more attorneys beside him. Civil rights groups had taken up her case. "They're afraid of you now," one of them whispered through the glass during a visitation. "Not because you've done anything wrong, but because your case has exposed their system. If you walk free, they'll have to admit to everything." Amara's heart twisted. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She just wanted to finish her studies, make her parents proud, and build a life. But it was too late. Her life was no longer her own. Meanwhile, online outrage turned into offline action. Rallies spread beyond her city. Major capitals across the world saw marches in her name. At one protest in London, tens of thousands filled the streets carrying signs with her face, chanting, "Her name is not a crime." In New York, activists projected her image onto the side of a skyscraper. Hashtags were painted on walls, plastered on billboards, sung in concerts. What started as a single shaky video had become a global movement, and still the system fought back. Officials quietly briefed sympathetic reporters with talking points, suggesting Amara had ties they couldn't reveal. They used words like classified and national security as shields, hoping to sway public opinion. Some networks ran with the angle, showing her picture alongside shadowy graphics of supposed terrorist networks. Even without evidence, suspicion seeped into the public's mind. If she was still in jail, wasn't there something the government knew? That was the question skeptics asked. But then came a revelation too big to ignore. Another whistleblower, this time from inside the detention center, leaked footage from a security camera. The video showed Amara during an interrogation. In it, the officer across from her said clearly, "We know you're not the one on the list, but your name came up, and that's enough for us." Amara's face in the footage was a mix of disbelief and devastation. The video spread within hours, shared millions of times. Outrage intensified. Human rights organizations issued statements condemning the government. Foreign leaders began to comment publicly, demanding answers. For Amara, the leak was both salvation and danger. Inside, guards turned colder. They barked at her more harshly, tightened restrictions, searched her cell daily. One evening, a guard hissed as he locked her door. "Keep your little fans outside, but don't expect it to help you in here." She realized then that the more the world knew, the more vulnerable she became within these walls. Her lawyer managed to deliver fragments of hope. "This is international now," he said urgently during a visit. "They can't bury this forever. Pressure is mounting, something has to break." Amara wanted to believe him, but her body felt weak, her spirit frayed. Nights were the worst, lying in darkness, her mind racing, wondering if she would survive long enough to see that break. Then something shocking happened. At one of her hearings, the judge suddenly imposed a gag order. Reporters in the courtroom were stunned. Effective immediately, no one was allowed to discuss or publish details of her case. Journalists were forced to leave, their cameras shut down. The silence was deafening. It was as if her existence was being erased piece by piece. Outside, when protesters realized the news blackout, they roared louder, but inside, Amara was left terrified. If they silenced the story, what was to stop them from silencing her? Her mother visited less often, not because she didn't want to, but because access was cut. On one visit, she clutched her daughter's hand through the glass and whispered, "I'm fighting for you every day. Don't let them break you." Amara nodded, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she felt. In the shadows, deals were being made. Officials debated internally whether to cut her loose quietly or keep tightening the noose. A leaked transcript from a closed-door meeting revealed the cold calculation. If she is released, the narrative shifts to government incompetence. If she remains detained, the narrative shifts to government strength. Optics favor the latter. It wasn't about her innocence, it was about optics, image, control. Meanwhile, her health worsened. She developed chest pains and was denied proper treatment. Other inmates urged guards to take her seriously, but their pleas were ignored. Her lawyer filed emergency motions, but the court responded slowly, each delay feeling deliberate. On the outside, the world was boiling. Thousands camped outside government buildings. International celebrities recorded videos in her defense. A global petition reached 2 million signatures. Yet even as the noise grew deafening, the machine of power churned on stubbornly. The cover-up deepened, each layer thicker than the last. Then, in a twist no one expected, prosecutors unveiled their so-called new charges. They claimed Amara had exchanged emails with suspicious contacts overseas. They presented heavily redacted printouts with entire pages blacked out. Her lawyers tore through the documents and discovered something laughable. The emails weren't even hers. The account name didn't match, the timestamps were inconsistent, and one message was dated when Amara was only 16 years old. Still, the court accepted the documents into record. Her attorneys protested furiously, but the judge overruled them. The shockwaves were immediate. The internet exploded with fury. People mocked the incompetents, posting memes of court officials saying, "Wrong name, wrong age, wrong gender, close enough." But for Amara, the laughter outside brought no comfort. She was still inside, still shackled by a system determined to keep her. That night, she collapsed in her cell, gasping for air. Finally, after hours of begging, she was taken to the infirmary. The doctor scribbled notes, muttered something about stress, and sent her back. Her chest still burned. She realized then that the system wasn't just trying to bury her story, it might be trying to bury her entirely. The next morning, whispers spread through the jail. A staff member had been suspended for allegedly leaking information to the press. No one knew who it was, but Amara suspected it was the same guard who had slipped her a sympathetic look weeks earlier. The message was clear. Anyone who tried to help her would pay. And yet, despite everything, the protests outside grew louder, bigger, more unignorable. Drone footage showed seas of people with banners stretching for miles. News anchors called it the largest demonstration the city had seen in decades. Her name had become a chant in multiple languages, a symbol beyond borders. But inside she sat in silence, her body weakening, her spirit stretched thin. Each day she asked herself the same question. Would she live to see freedom, or would she become another name erased by a system too afraid to admit its mistakes? Then came the revelation that shook even her supporters to the core. A second whistleblower released a voice recording of a senior official saying, "We can't release her now. If she walks free, we lose credibility. Better she disappears quietly than for us to admit we got it wrong." The words sent shockwaves across the world. Social media caught fire. Protesters outside the jail doubled in number overnight. International news led with the story. Governments abroad condemned the revelation. Calls for sanctions and inquiries echoed across diplomatic circles. And yet, Amara remained in her cell, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy, her breath shallow. The world knew the truth now, but truth alone had never been enough to free her. The cover-up had reached its breaking point. The question was, would it collapse, or would it consume her completely? The night after the second whistleblower's recording leaked, the air outside the detention center crackled with anger. Thousands of protesters stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising into the cold night sky. Some held candles, others held signs with Amara's face, and together they formed a wall of defiance against the silence of the system. The chant echoed endlessly. "Her name is not a crime. Her name is not a crime." News helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the crowds like restless eyes. Inside her cell, Amara could feel the vibrations through the walls. She pressed her ear to the concrete, straining to catch the muffled roar of the people outside. For the first time in weeks, she felt less alone, but she also felt the tightening grip of fear. The louder the world became, the harsher her captors treated her. Guards barked insults, dragged her roughly during searches, and restricted her movements further. At meals, some slammed her tray down with deliberate force. It was their way of reminding her the world might scream outside, but in here, she belonged to them. Her lawyer returned with a grim face. "The government has doubled down again," he said, his voice low through the glass. "They're filing additional charges, conspiracy, obstruction, even attempted fraud." Amara's mouth fell open. "Fraud? For what?" He sighed. "They claim your scholarship documents were falsified." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. That scholarship was her lifeline, her one chance to build a future. She had earned it through endless nights of study, through sacrifice, through resilience, and now they were calling it a lie. Her lawyers filed motions to dismiss, but the judge allowed the charges to proceed. The court was no longer a place of law. It was theatre, a stage where the system performed its power. Reporters barred from hearings filled airtime with speculation. Some asked if this meant the government really had evidence. Others dismissed the charges as desperate grasping. But to Amara, sitting in her cell, it felt like a tightening noose. Then came the twist. A sympathetic journalist slipped her lawyers a confidential report. It revealed that weeks before her arrest, security agencies had received warnings about their outdated watchlist system. Names were often duplicated, spellings mismatched, and false positives rampant. The report had even listed specific recommendations: verify gender, verify date of birth, verify citizenship before making arrests. Those safeguards had been ignored. Worse, the report included a footnote: high likelihood of false detainment of individuals with common names, particularly from minority groups. Her case wasn't an accident, it was predicted. The system had known this would happen, had chosen to look the other way, and had sacrificed her when the moment arrived. The revelation was devastating. It confirmed everything activists had been shouting. Amara wasn't just caught in a mistake. She was collateral in a system that had been warned and chose not to care. The leak hit international headlines. Outrage exploded again, louder than ever. Protests spread to multiple continents. Parliamentarians in other countries stood up in their chambers demanding her release. Human rights lawyers filed petitions to international courts. For a brief moment, it seemed the tide was unstoppable. But then, as quickly as the report had surfaced, it was discredited. Government spokespeople claimed it was incomplete and taken out of context. State media began running stories suggesting the report had been fabricated by activist groups. A chilling campaign of disinformation began, muddying the waters until the public no longer knew what to believe. For Amara, the cycle was unbearable. Hope would rise with each leak, each protest, each headline, only to be crushed again when the system buried it. Her health declined further. Her chest pains grew sharper, her breath shorter. She often sat on the edge of her bunk, clutching her ribs, whispering prayers into the darkness. Other inmates began looking at her with pity, as if they knew she might not survive long enough to see freedom. One night, her mother was finally allowed to visit after weeks of silence. She pressed her hand to the glass, tears running down her face. "Hold on, Amara. Please, hold on. People are fighting for you. Don't give up now." Amara nodded, but she could barely speak. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm so tired, Mama." So tired. Her mother pressed harder, her own tears falling fast. "If you can't do it for yourself, do it for me. Survive this so I can see you walk out of here." Those words lit a flicker in Amara's chest. She clung to them like a lifeline. But survival was becoming a question of politics, not will. Behind closed doors, prosecutors prepared for a new move. Documents later leaked showed their strategy. If public pressure grew unbearable, they would quietly release her, but attach new conditions: house arrest, travel bans, and a sealed record branding her as a person of interest for life. In other words, freedom in name only. The protests reached their peak when tens of thousands gathered outside the national parliament. Drone footage of the crowd went viral, and speeches echoed through the streets. "If they can do this to Amara, they can do it to any of us. We demand justice." Some protesters clashed with police. Tear gas filled the air. Videos of officers beating demonstrators spread online, only fueling more outrage. The government was no longer just on trial for Amara, it was on trial for its entire system of profiling and silence. Inside, Amara felt the pressure mounting but couldn't see the full scale. She knew only what scraps her lawyers told her. She heard the chants faintly some nights, carried by the wind. She pressed her hands to the walls, imagining the faces outside, strangers chanting her name as if it belonged to them too. Then, in an extraordinary moment, a judge unexpectedly called for a closed review of her case. Rumors swirled that international pressure had forced the move. Her lawyers rushed to prepare. For days, Amara sat in her cell, waiting, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment the truth broke through. On the morning of the hearing, guards shackled her wrists and ankles and led her into a courtroom buzzing with tension. Her lawyers argued fiercely, presenting every inconsistency: the mismatched spellings, the wrong gender, the wrong age, the scholarship records, the leaked recordings. They laid it all bare. For the first time, Amara saw cracks in the judge's stern mask. Then the prosecutor rose. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. Even if there are discrepancies, Your Honor, even if some details do not align, the fact remains. Her name appeared. And in matters of national security, we cannot take chances. The statement hung in the air like smoke, heavy and poisonous. The judge recessed for deliberation. Amara sat trembling, her wrists aching in the cuffs. Her lawyers whispered encouragement, but their faces betrayed doubt. Hours passed before the gavel finally sounded again. The judge cleared his throat. This court acknowledges the discrepancies presented. However, given the circumstances and the potential risk involved, the defendant will remain in custody pending resolution of new charges. Amara's world collapsed. Tears stung her eyes, her body sagged in the chair. Around the courtroom, gasps echoed. Her mother wept openly, shouting, "How long will you destroy her life?" Guards pulled Amara to her feet and dragged her away. She could barely feel her legs beneath her. The news shattered supporters outside. Protests erupted into chaos, police clashing with furious crowds. The disappointment was suffocating. The sense of betrayal deepened. And then came the breaking point. That night, another leak surfaced, this one even more explosive than before. A video recorded secretly inside a government office. In it, a senior official was heard saying, "We can't let her go now. If she walks free, the whole system falls apart. The best solution is to keep her locked until the noise dies down, or make sure she doesn't walk out at all." The words reverberated like thunder. The implication was clear. They weren't just holding her, they were considering erasing her. Permanently. The internet erupted. Hashtags turned into calls for international intervention. Human rights organizations demanded urgent action. Foreign governments threatened sanctions. Protesters outside the detention center swelled into the largest crowd yet, their chants shaking the night air. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Sirens wailed. The city became a battleground between truth and power. Inside her cell, Amara sat in the darkness, her chest aching, her breath ragged. She didn't know about the new leak yet. She didn't know the world was on fire in her name. She only knew the silence of the walls, the taste of fear in her mouth, the crushing weight of uncertainty. And then, as midnight struck, her cell door creaked open. Two guards stood in the hallway, their faces expressionless. One said quietly, "Get up. You're being transferred." Amara's blood ran cold. She had heard stories of transfers. Some inmates never returned. She rose slowly, her body trembling, her heart pounding like a drum. She stepped into the hallway, shackles heavy around her ankles. The guards flanked her, leading her into the shadows. Behind those walls, no cameras could see. No chants could reach. No protests could protect her. And outside, the world braced, not knowing if Amara would live to see the morning.